The drama began quietly, almost in whispers, when a series of leaked documents revealed that Starmer's government had been involved in a highly controversial arrangement that many described as a betrayal of democratic principles. For weeks, rumors swirled through Parliament, but the Prime Minister's team dismissed them as political gamesmanship. Yet behind the scenes, powerful forces were already aligning, and a case had been escalated all the way to the Supreme Court. What followed was a legal showdown unlike anything Britain has witnessed in decades, a battle not just over politics, but over the very legitimacy of the man sitting at the highest seat of power. When the ruling finally came, it landed like an earthquake. The judges, after hours of tense deliberation, declared that Starmer had violated constitutional boundaries in ways that could no longer be ignored. The judgment was merciless. It demanded his immediate resignation, citing breaches of trust, misuse of authority, and actions that undermined the very foundations of the democratic system. In that moment, Starmer's carefully constructed image of control and confidence collapsed in front of the nation. He had fought to project himself as the savior who could steer Britain through crisis, but now he stood exposed as a leader fatally wounded by his own decisions. The fallout was immediate and brutal. Allies within his party, who had once praised him as Labour's great hope, began to scatter. Some resigned on the spot, unwilling to be tied to a sinking ship. Others kept their silence, watching as the Prime Minister's credibility burned away like paper in fire. The opposition pounced, demanding not only his resignation, but also a full public inquiry into the scandal that had triggered the court's intervention. It was political bloodsport at its most ruthless, and Starmer was the hunted prey. Across the country, ordinary citizens were stunned. For many, Starmer's downfall was proof that even the most powerful could be held accountable. For others, it was yet another betrayal from a political class that seemed to thrive on secrets and self-interest. Protests broke out in London, Manchester, and Birmingham, with demonstrators demanding answers, accountability, and above all, a fresh start. Meanwhile, the media descended into a frenzy, broadcasting every detail, every rumor, every speculation about who might replace him and what this meant for the future of Britain. In the heart of Westminster, the atmosphere was nothing short of apocalyptic. Ministers were seen rushing through corridors, their faces tight with fear. Civil servants whispered of chaos at the very core of government, with departments paralyzed by uncertainty. The resignation of a prime minister is always a national shock, but under the hammer of a Supreme Court ruling, it carried an even darker significance. This was not a voluntary departure, not a carefully managed exit. It was a forced humiliation, one that would be etched into Britain's political history forever. And as the news spread beyond the borders of the UK, international allies and rivals alike watched closely. Questions began to swirl in Brussels, Washington, and Paris. Could Britain still be trusted? And who would emerge to fill the vacuum of leadership? The stage was set for a showdown not just within the Labour Party, but across the entire political landscape of the country. Keir Starmer's fall was not just his personal disgrace. It was a tremor shaking the very foundations of British democracy. As the shock of the Supreme Court ruling rippled through the nation, the focus quickly turned to the murky details that had brought Keir Starmer to this unprecedented downfall. The leaked evidence, which had initially been dismissed as political gossip, was now being laid bare for the world to see. Within those documents were agreements and correspondences suggesting that Starmer had pursued deals behind closed doors, bypassing parliamentary oversight and ignoring critical legal safeguards. What stunned observers was not just the nature of the deals, but the brazen confidence with which they were carried out, as though the Prime Minister believed he was untouchable. It was this arrogance, critics argued, that had finally led him to his destruction. The revelations painted a picture of a government operating in shadows, hidden from the very people it was supposed to serve. Meetings with EU figures, secret commitments to policy changes, and questionable financial trails all formed part of the explosive puzzle. Some analysts claimed these actions amounted to nothing less than a betrayal of the public trust, a direct assault on the very principles Starmer had once vowed to defend. The more the evidence was discussed on television and dissected in newspapers, the more the outrage spread. Starmer was no longer just a weakened leader. He was now seen as a symbol of everything wrong with modern politics: secrecy, deception, and unchecked ambition. Inside Downing Street, the atmosphere turned poisonous. Ministers who had once sat proudly at Starmer's cabinet table now scrambled to distance themselves from him, issuing carefully worded statements that expressed deep concern while avoiding direct loyalty. A few brave allies attempted to defend him, arguing that the court's judgment had been harsh, perhaps even politically motivated. But their voices were drowned out by the roar of critics both inside and outside his own party. The Labour leadership, once united under the banner of renewal and progress, was fracturing before the nation's eyes. Each resignation letter, each public statement of disapproval, drove the dagger deeper into Starmer's authority. Meanwhile, the opposition parties wasted no time in capitalizing on the chaos. Conservative leaders seized the opportunity to present themselves as the stable alternative, declaring that Labour had proven itself incapable of governing responsibly. The Liberal Democrats, too, joined the chorus, demanding fresh elections to restore public faith. And on the far edges of the political spectrum, smaller parties fanned the flames of discontent, warning that the entire political establishment was rotten to its core. For the average voter, it became increasingly difficult to know whom to trust. The sense of betrayal was so deep that faith in any leader seemed almost impossible. Beyond the walls of Parliament, the crisis triggered an emotional earthquake among the British public. Many citizens, already struggling with economic hardship, rising costs, and social instability, felt abandoned by a government consumed by scandal. The Supreme Court ruling did not feel like justice alone. It felt like an admission that the very people entrusted with leadership had failed them completely. Some saw the collapse of Starmer's premiership as a warning that Britain was heading into uncharted territory, where the rules of politics no longer applied and where chaos could become the new normal. The international dimension added yet another layer of pressure. Reports from Brussels suggested that EU leaders were furious over the leaks, which exposed private discussions that had never been meant for public eyes. In Washington, officials expressed concern about the stability of Britain's leadership at a time when global cooperation was critical. Foreign media outlets broadcast dramatic headlines, portraying the UK as a nation consumed by political crisis, its prime minister toppled in disgrace by the very institutions meant to uphold democracy. Britain's reputation, once carefully guarded, was being shredded on the global stage. Yet the most unsettling aspect of this unfolding drama was the sense that the crisis was far from over. With Starmer's resignation forced, the next battle had already begun, the fight over who would succeed him, and whether Labour could survive the damage intact. Potential successors were quietly maneuvering in the background, their allies spreading whispers through the press, while party factions sharpened their knives. The struggle for power promised to be as brutal as the fall of Starmer himself, and for many, it raised a chilling prospect, that the chaos was only just beginning. Britain now stood at a crossroads, its political landscape scarred by scandal, its leadership shattered, and its people desperate for answers. And as the nation held its breath, one truth became undeniable. The downfall of Keir Starmer was not the end of the story, but the opening chapter of a crisis that threatened to engulf the entire country. The storm unleashed by the Supreme Court ruling did not fade with Starmer's resignation. Instead, it intensified, turning into a political fire that spread across every corner of the country. As the Prime Minister's authority collapsed, his enemies, rivals, and even former allies began circling like vultures over a wounded prey. The Labour Party, once celebrating its dominance after years in opposition, now looked like a fractured army, torn apart by mistrust and bitterness. Every faction blamed another. Moderates accused the left wing of abandoning discipline, while radicals condemned the leadership for betraying the people's will. What was once the pride of Starmer's vision now resembled a battlefield of broken promises and shattered ambitions. In the corridors of Westminster, whispers grew louder. Some MPs argued that Starmer should fight back, that he should challenge the court's authority or appeal to the public for sympathy. But those whispers quickly died as reality set in. His career was over, and the court's ruling had left no room for maneuver. Instead, attention shifted to who might replace him, and whether anyone could salvage the party from total implosion. Names like Angela Rayner, Wes Streeting, and even old heavyweights resurfaced, each carefully crafting their image as the potential savior of Labour. Yet the public saw through the scramble for power, interpreting it not as leadership, but as desperation. For the citizens of Britain, this power struggle felt like a cruel distraction from their daily suffering. Rising energy bills, an unforgiving housing crisis, and the erosion of savings had already left millions on edge. To them, the chaos in London was not a distant drama, but a personal threat to their futures. Ordinary people ask the same haunting question. If those at the top are consumed by scandal and betrayal, who is left to protect us? Protesters began gathering in major cities, demanding accountability, fresh elections, and an end to what they called The corruption of the elite. The chants echoed through the streets, a chilling reminder that the anger outside Parliament was reaching boiling point. Meanwhile, the press fed the nation's fury with headline after headline. Leaked documents continued to emerge, each one darker than the last, showing the extent of secret negotiations and questionable dealings. Some reports suggested Starmer had promised concessions to European leaders that undermined British sovereignty, while others hinted at financial backers who stood to gain from his hidden deals. Whether all the claims were true or exaggerated no longer mattered. In the eyes of the people, the damage was irreversible. The words betrayal and disgrace dominated every front page, ensuring that the former Prime Minister's legacy would forever be tied to scandal. The opposition, sensing blood in the water, pressed their advantage. Conservative leaders demanded immediate elections, arguing that Labour had lost the moral right to govern. Even smaller parties joined the chorus, predicting that Starmer's fall was only the beginning of a broader collapse. Inside the Labour ranks, MPs began drafting motions of no confidence not just against Starmer, but against the entire leadership team that had enabled him. The crisis, once centered on one man, now threatened to drag the entire party into ruin. Yet perhaps the most dangerous aspect of the turmoil was the vacuum it created. Britain suddenly found itself leaderless, adrift in a sea of uncertainty at a time when the economy was fragile. International alliances were strained and public trust in politics was collapsing. Foreign governments watched nervously, wondering who would take control and whether Britain could still be relied upon as a partner. At home, families feared what the instability would mean for their jobs, their homes, and their savings. The sense of dread was palpable, as if the country were standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting for the ground to give way beneath them. Behind closed doors, Labour insiders admitted what many already suspected. This was more than a scandal. It was an existential crisis. Some feared that the party could be wiped out in the next election, reduced to a shadow of its former strength. Others believed that out of the ashes, a new movement might rise, one untainted by the corruption of the past. But no one could deny the truth. The collapse of Keir Starmer had opened a wound so deep that it might never fully heal. The chaos was not just political, it was personal. Voters who had once placed their faith in Labour now felt abandoned and betrayed. Many spoke of never trusting politicians again, no matter their party or promises. That loss of faith, some experts warned, was more dangerous than any leadership crisis. Because when the people no longer believe in the system itself, the entire foundation of democracy begins to crack. And as Britain stumbled into this new era of distrust, one terrifying reality became clear. The resignation of Keir Starmer was not the solution to the crisis. It was only the spark that had lit the fire, a fire that now threatened to consume not only a party, but the entire political order of the nation. As the dust of Starmer's downfall settled, Britain found itself staring into a future clouded with doubt, fear, and unanswered questions. The resignation of a prime minister under the shadow of a Supreme Court ruling was not just a political drama, it was a seismic event that shook the very foundations of democracy. For generations, the people had believed in the stability of their institutions, yet this crisis revealed just how fragile those structures truly were. Starmer's disgrace became more than the end of one man's career. It became a symbol of a nation standing at a dangerous crossroads. In the immediate aftermath, Parliament descended into scenes rarely witnessed in modern history. Heated arguments erupted, with MPs hurling accusations across the chamber. Some shouted that Starmer's fall was long overdue. Others claimed it was a judicial coup that threatened the balance of power. The Speaker struggled to keep order as chaos swept through the benches. For the first time in decades, it felt as though the political establishment itself was unraveling before the eyes of the world. Outside the chamber, protesters clashed with police, their anger feeding off the spectacle of a government in total collapse. Meanwhile, speculation over the future of leadership grew more intense by the hour. Figures once dismissed as backbenchers now stepped forward, each presenting themselves as the savior who could restore order. Yet none seemed capable of uniting a party so deeply fractured. Some insiders even whispered that Labour might split into separate factions, a devastating blow that would echo across decades of British politics. And in the middle of this scramble, one haunting question persisted. Had Starmer's fall created an opportunity for renewal? For Starmer himself, the silence was deafening. Reports indicated he had retreated from public life, surrounded by a small circle of advisors, wrestling with the weight of disgrace. Some claimed he was drafting a memoir to defend his actions, Others whispered of a quiet deal that would allow him to avoid further investigations. But whatever his fate, one truth was undeniable. The once proud leader who had promised to restore trust in politics had instead become a cautionary tale of power, secrecy, and downfall. As Britain watched its political system buckle, ordinary families were left to wonder what the future held. Would a new leader rise to unite the nation? Or would the chaos deepen, dragging the country into years of uncertainty? Nobody had the answers. What was clear, however, was that the resignation was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of something far greater, something darker, something that would decide the fate of Britain for generations. The Supreme Court's ruling had lit the fuse, but the explosion was still unfolding. With every day that passed, the crisis grew less about one man and more about the survival of the system itself. And as citizens looked on, fearful yet captivated, one chilling reality set in. The old order was gone, and whatever came next would reshape Britain forever.